So, Jim and Austin, I wonder if Zelensky's attaché after the meeting with Trump took him down to Barnes and Noble and bought a copy Art of the Deal. It looks like he may need it.
I suppose somebody already recommended that to him. He got a lesson in Trump 101 if he didn't need it. And I'm sure he's going to pay attention. He apparently is, because he has no other, no other help coming to him other than from the United States. Yeah, NATO in Europe is trying to put something together, but they finally realized that they've been depending on us for too long, too much, and it's going to take them a while to spin up, as it were. So for the moment, Putin's in the prime position. We are weak. He is strong, but he's got problems as well.
Right. Although he has made sure his military manufacturing and like that has stayed up. I read a article just before we started that part of his country has the ability to continue for 2 to 3 years as is, especially with the input from the North Koreans. So he knows that he's got 2 to 3 years that he can continue what he's doing right now.
Yes, his economy is in bad shape, but the Russians are used to that. He's basically pushing these messages he's always been pushing, in that Russia is under siege. NATO is trying to encircle and destroy us. That always plays to the Russian public. But it's not true. That's immaterial. But he's going to try and play this for whatever he can get. I don't know exactly what he wants. He wants Ukraine, but after Ukraine, what comes next? And that's what bothers everybody. The Central Asian states are visibly agitated because they know they're next on the list, and that Putin is intent on reassembling the Soviet Union.
Right. And so that's the thing. Do we stop him now or do we stop him later?
Well,
Whether the Ukrainians have the ability to stop him by themselves is unclear. They're starting to lose in various places. Their Kursk initiative, they're starting to fall back there. They're starting to fall back in the eastern areas there in Ukraine. And so they're having manpower issues. They're in serious problems right now.
Russia is in worse shape. They are basically out of soldiers. The ones they have are older and younger, as it were. They're not being trained. They have weapons. Sure, they can get that from North Korea, but they can't win the war. Putin is trying to convince the world that it's not true, but let's face it, what's he got? He hasn't got much. He hasn't got anything at all. And I think, as you or Austin pointed out, if we don't stop him in Ukraine, are we going to do it in Poland, in Germany? He's dealing a weak hand. He hasn't got much to offer in terms of military power. He says he does, but he doesn't. I mean, he's importing Koreans, and half of them are out of action already. He basically cannot fight a long war. He says he can, but he can't. He hasn't got the troops. He hasn't got the equipment. I mean, he's got equipment, but he's basically dredging the bottom of the barrel. You're seeing more T-55s on the battlefield. The Russian armor force has basically been eliminated, since 2 years ago. His soldiers are deserting. They're fleeing the country. The young men are fleeing the country. They're evading the recruiters, or I should say the people who are basically rounding you up, whether you want to go in the army or not. So he's got a rebellion, as it were, inside of Russia. He's got an economy that is creaking along after years of sanctions, and he's got an enemy who has still got the backing of Europe and the United States. Now, the Americans are saying, no, we want a ceasefire, we want a treaty. But I don't believe Trump realizes that Vladimir Putin is a known liar. You can't trust anything he says. He started that in '94, and he's continued. So he's going to try and lie his way into any favorable deal he can get. And I don't really think enough Westerners are going to fall for that. So it doesn't look good for the Russians. And he basically is trying to stir up as much, doubt, uncertainty, and fear as he possibly can, because that's the best weapon he has right now.
Austin, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, the best weapon he has now is the threat of nuclear war. That's a very, very dicey thing to threaten on Putin's part. But it's something that he's been called on that threat several times since February 2022. More or less implied that threat even in 2014, 2015, in the early days of the slow war in the Donbass after Putin's regime had seized and annexed Crimea. Now, I'm going to explain my blunt statement. Sure, he is signing his own death warrant, I think, if he actually used it. Might get away with it with a nuclear demonstration on Russian soil or maybe in Ukraine, but maybe not. That's a no-no. It's be a no-no for, I'll call it, free Europe, because everything from Poland and Latvia, Lithuania, west, I can go down there. Turkey's far freer. Most of the countries around it, not freer than Greece, but they're down there on the southeastern flank, same way. So let's just refer to it as you can't say Western Europe anymore, because Central Europe is free by comparative standards with the rest of the world. So it's, and I'm going to insert this and then come back to the thought here about what Putin's options are. Russia's already lost this war strategically, and they lost it as soon as Finland and Sweden started participating in NATO war games and now have become part of NATO. The charade that NATO is invading Russia is a fraud. NATO's a defensive alliance, and even the Finns and Swedes now have shed their Cold War neutralism and are part of the club. The Finns, by the way, Jim once said the Finns have the best military reputation in Europe. They do from just World War II, but it's Finland's a nation in arms, just like Israel is, and South Korea, and Ukraine, to a high degree, has become a nation in arms. In other words, the entire nation. You invade them, they're going to fight you. Switzerland's supposed to be, but it hasn't been tested in several centuries. Sweden makes great weapons, and they're on their way. They've been steadily increasing their defense budget. And they have been really since 2015, 2016, and it was organic, even though Trump's demanding it, and they got to get up to 2% supposedly to get into NATO. The Swedes begin putting their money where their defense needs are, and Poland certainly does it. Now, Poland has, you get this on tertiary level whispers, hey, wait a minute, if Putin goes nuclear, should we get nukes? Because he wouldn't have invaded Ukraine if Ukraine had kept its nukes. Same way that South Korea and Japan talk about possibly obtaining nuclear weapons to thwart China. Poland has asked that the U.S., and this is within the last 3 or 4 days, but I know it's been on the table, that U.S. Put nuclear forces in Poland, move them from where we've got them in Germany, northern Italy. Jim, do we still have some in the Benelux? I don't know.
I don't believe so, no.
Yeah, okay, but we've got them in Italy, northern Italy, and we did have some in Sicily at one time, and predominantly they're in Germany, or offshore submarines and on carriers carrying nuclear weapons. But Poland's asked for it, or suggested that it happen, to act as a block, a diplomatic and political block, to further Russian expansion if the Russians succeed in conquering Ukraine, which Putin says is his goal. So let's get back to it. Do I think Putin, and we're personalizing it because he is the driving force in this stupid war that Russia has. I call him a megalomaniac and have for really 2 decades since that he wanted to revive the Soviet Union, which was the Tsarist Romanov Empire under communism, and basically said as much in 2004. I got a column that's still up on the strategy page from November 2004, where it's the first time I actually wrote it, but Jim and I talked about this. I came up with it as a quip in a speech I gave in the late 1990s. Rubik, like Rubik's Cube, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. Well, it's a formulation for a superpower. You got enough people, you got the resources, food and fuels and minerals, and it would be the Eurasian superpower that Russia was, that the Soviet Union was, and he announced it then. Everything but saying that this is something he was going to proceed to try to recreate. He's been somewhat successful. Belarus is an occupied Russian joke. Kazakhstan, maybe not. It's hard to get to. But there's Ukraine with all the food resources, all the heavy industry, and along the Donbass, ethnic Russians. And he finally goes for it in 2014. And on March 18th, 2014, he annexes Crimea into Russia, and that was broke the understanding of the end of World War II that you weren't going to take territory by force. You could have a honest plebiscite, or you could buy it, but you didn't invade and take it. Of course, his justification on Crimea was, hey, it was Russian territory, but what was it, 54, I think, or 56, that Khrushchev, it was after Stalin died, Khrushchev, a Ukrainian, gives Crimea to Ukraine as brotherly act of communist good fellowship within the Soviet Union. So that the Russians could make a case that, well, it was taken by Khrushchev and added to Ukraine, and it really belongs to us. But they didn't negotiate about it. They had a kind of sort of agreement out of the 1994 Budapest Accord, because Sevastopol remained a Russian naval base. Russia had a huge presence down there, and it was, I think the lease was 50 years, but it was basically understood to be in perpetuity. Working fine. You work out of there, and that's been Russia's primary Black Sea and naval base. But now Putin, revanchist that he is, to use a classic term for somebody who wants land that they claim is rightly theirs. Of course, it causes wars all over Europe, caused wars elsewhere in Eurasia, causes wars in Africa. Even though some of those are basically tribal wars, it's my tribe had this 8 generations ago, and I want it back. And that's essentially what the revanchist Russians now trying to reassemble. I prefer to call it the Tsarist Empire. Say this is great Russia control this, and we're going to control it again. Now, let's get back to Jim's point. I don't think Putin's Russia, has the power to take all of Ukraine. I don't think I think Russia has the forces to hold what it's got, particularly if they constantly have the threat of using a nuclear weapon. But do they have the economic stamina? Do they ultimately have the psychological stamina and faith in Putin? And what the heck is his own physical shape? Does he have heart problems? I mean, you can still operate if he has Parkinson's, is one of the, you read down in the British tabloids that he's got Parkinson's and other diseases, but just consider the source. Is he in it for the long haul? Maybe not. I concluded the column I wrote this way, Creator Syndicate column that's on strategy page, that after Putin's gone, after he dies, if you stabilize the situation, get a ceasefire like Trump is trying to do, what happens after he's gone? Does Russia still intend to hold it, the new regime? What if they're not these romantic megalomaniacs like Putin? And most of them aren't. They're oligarchs, and they're interested in deals. They're interested in money. They're interested in having the freedom to fly from Moscow to London and party, which they're sanctioned, and they can't do it with the same freedom that they could prior to 2014 and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So you're looking at a window here of instability, threat, end of a ceasefire, and it's because of Putin, which is why we get back to one of the early columns I wrote. The way to solve this is the 9mm solution, as they used to call it, which is he's killed. It's hard to get to him. Now, that's a brutal way of putting it, but he's the instigator, has been the instigator, has the power to do it, does have an appeal to Russian ultranationalists that are part of this, greater Russia romantic dream. And Russia is armed and Russia is powerful. And it's got tons and tons of minerals, and it's got tons and tons and tons of fossil fuels. And they can use them all as cash crops. As Jim points out, to get back to it, you got to pay for it with all the sanctions. Russia's in sad shape right now. I think so. This is get down to the point about Trump. Trump sees all this, and he's going to disrupt current thinking, past thinking, stop the bleeding, and then we'll build from there.
So, Jim, what do you think Trump's chances are of getting a ceasefire and then moving on from there to getting some sort of deal where the fighting stops completely?
Well, the ceasefire, but the Russians won't follow it. There'll be violations, which they'll deny. Although in this day of the internet and camera phones, you'll have plenty of visual and audible evidence that it's being violated. He'll just deny. Putin will always be Putin. If he can lie his way out of the situation, he will certainly try. And if he lies and fails, he'll lie about his failure. So you're dealing with a man who can't be trusted. Putin has broken just about every agreement he's made. So you can't expect him to change all of a sudden. I think, as Austin mentioned, a 9mm solution might work. But, in Russia, there are too many people, eager to replace Putin. Whether or not they want to make the same mistakes Putin made, it's hard to say. The Russians are one of those countries that never misses an opportunity to miss an opportunity, and that's why they're in such bad shape right now.
It's hard to believe that the other powers that are in Russia just are going to sit there on those trillions of dollars of resources and want to start taking advantage of those, because it's like Putin knows himself that they've got lots and lots of resources, but while he's in power, they're not going to be able to make deals with other countries for those.
Well, Putin has established a police state. He has complete control over the country. He's got, intelligence and security organizations watching each other. It's a classical dictator, security arrangement. But as we all understand, the economy is a mess. And as long as the economy is sanctioned, is shrinking, there's less, goodies to give out to people who will be your allies as long as you can pay them. In Russia, you're always in danger of being, how should I put it, accidentally lost. Falling out of a building, high window, high story building, disappearing for whatever reason. Putin has had assassinated critics in the past, one way or another. So if you're gonna, like you said, if you're gonna make a move against the king, you better succeed, because coming in second, means you're dead. Putin is running a kingdom of fear, and it's a short-term operation. And Trump, for all we know, he's a smart guy. He may realize that if he can just simply get Putin to call a ceasefire and break it, he will basically turn himself into a pariah. And he's already a pariah to most Russians and all of his neighbors. They don't trust him, and they're not going to make any deal with him that they expect to last.
I think you mentioned
Dan,
something in an email to us, Austin, that Trump may be laying a trap for Putin.
Yeah. And actually, I had suggested this kind of undercurrent a couple of times in not just emails, a couple of things I've written within the last few months. But can Putin be trapped to some degree? If take what Jim says about the Russian economy and the Russian will to fight, as expressed in so many young men fleeing Russia. Also, the young technical elites that are now living in Turkey or have, even though Finland won't take anymore, fled to Finland, Western Europe, other places. Comparatively well-educated and wealthy young Russians have fled, the kind of people you need to run a modern information industrial country. So in some ways, he's gone about dismantling the state that he wants to build simultaneously because of the violence against Russians, the oppressive police state, and then the waging wars that has impoverished the country. So he's created conditions for his self-entrapment. But as Jim says, and as we go back and look at things that appeared on strategy page over the last 23, 24 years, talking about Putin and Putin's Russia. What you're referring to is Trump setting what I said conditions for a trap. The trap's already set. Is really what I'm saying. Is you just have to expose Putin for the liar he is internationally. And if he comes in and Trump's deal and it's laid and he's agreed to it, even though it's only a 30-day ceasefire, as Jim says, with the proliferation of cell phones and drones, satellites, you can see when somebody breaks the ceasefire. You can pinpoint where it is. You might even be able to have the names of the individuals involved, and then the person responsible for it, the dictatorship ultimately, is Putin. Is that going to topple him in Russia? I don't think so, at least not yet. But what does it do for the United States and what I was calling free Europe? It gives you a carte blanche to say and choose, all right, we tried it the 50-50 way. We're not going to try it the 50-50 way again. Okay, Ukraine, you get this increased military materiel. Perhaps you provide with Western forces, maybe even U.S. forces in Poland, extended anti-missile protection, air defense, air and space defense protection for the whole of Ukraine. Essentially, erase Russia's or badly make it very, very difficult for Russia to carry out the kind of city-busting tactics that it has been with ballistic missiles and suicide drones. We're putting a kind of sort of iron dome over most of Ukraine. And it's sold as defensive because it is defensive. Then you could move up to a level as we have made this deal with Ukraine vis-a-vis all these strategic minerals. And that's been part of the way Trump set the deal up. That's important to us. And here becomes the dicey part on this. We're going to defend it if you attack it again. And if you look at where a lot of these minerals are, some of them are in the occupied part of the Donbass, and some of them are in areas that are contested right now. I mean, they're not there. I saw 3 or 4 different maps. One in Financial Times, another one, and they don't all match up. But basically, there are a lot of these strategic minerals are in contested areas. And so the United States and free Europe say, we're going to protect those. Well, we're there and we've got troops there, and don't you dare attack them. We go to war. And they said, you're already at war and you had a ceasefire. And we could be in there developing them. And you're attacking our assets. You see, the next step then is you provide joint direct attack munitions. And I pointed out in this week's column, and this is missed by a lot of legacy media, that the talk going largely, oh, there are these NATO exercises, the U.S. isn't participating in them. Well, yes, the U.S. has been participating in them. The exercise up in Finland, where Finnish fighters escorted B-52s in to launch a JDAM strike on a Finnish training area. As the crow flies, about 100 miles from the Russian border. Another long flight, B-52s dropping heavy bombs that have a long drop distance. The standoff weapon, you can use it as a standoff weapon. But it was a show of force by the United States. And as I pointed out, Russia's already pulled back a lot of its strategic bombers back towards the Barents Sea and its bases up on the Kola Peninsula, northern Russia, or pulled them back to the Urals bases back there to protect these big bombers from Ukrainian drones. Well, guess what? They're sitting ducks for U.S. strategic bombers, much less many of our other weapon systems. We could destroy your entire strategic bomber fleet very, very quickly, is what that B-52 training strike, and I think it occurred March 6th, because
2 days ago.
Barents Observer, the Barents Observer reported March 7th. That's a part of Trump's negotiation. I guarantee it is. We didn't advertise it, but Moscow knows it happened.
Well, there were photos on X of the B-52s being escorted in.
Okay, all right, Dan. I missed that on X, but I'm also talking about some of the other things, the classic media. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, heck, it was reported in Barents Observer, and there were 4 or 5 other little places around, and strategy page. It's not like people don't know about it. But the point is that opens up this option that I'm saying is, Putin trapping himself if he doesn't hold up the agreement. Jim says Putin is a liar and you can't trust him and he's going to cheat. And that's just the way he is. I say the same thing, and I just add megalomaniac because he is a megalomaniac. And you're dealing with a megalomaniac sitting on a state that has nuclear weapons and all the trillions in resources that you mentioned. It's him you got to get rid of. And maybe you can impeach him even in front of his own people with this deal. It's that Trump's not going to be impeached, and Trump's not going to let himself be played a fool either. That Putin knows that about Trump. That's the other thing in this deal, because Trump's put himself out there, and we all know what he's like. As you opened up with, Zelensky should have read Art of the Deal, see? And that's funny. But it's funny when it's just, dealing with setting up, building a new hotel. Now you're trying to stop a war that one side's got nuclear weapons, and the other side did have nuclear weapons until 1994 with that Budapest Accord, which Ukraine gave up its nukes for assurances of the sovereignty of its territory, which Putin violated that, and here we are. Trump doesn't want a nuclear war. That is one thing that is definite about it, and I pointed this out in an earlier column. Heck, it's in Cocktails from Hell, that 1999 on Meet the Press. That was what he was talking about vis-a-vis North Korea. It's the biggest foreign policy problem the world has is nuclear weapons, and we've got to avoid nuclear war. It's been something that he's been talking about. When he was still a Democrat, a showman, in 1999, and nobody ever thought he'd run for president.
Yeah,
he did.
He doesn't want that. The one thing that I think he finally got through to Zelensky after Zelensky left was that they got through to him is, let us handle this. Don't inject yourself into what we're doing with the Russians. Step back. We'll take care of this. We've got you. We're not going to, harm you. Let us proceed. And it seems like that's what they've done. They're not injecting themselves into the talks. We're holding talks with both nations as we go forward. And we'll just have to see how it all plays out.
You see, he sets up the perception that the U.S. a perception that the U.S. is going to be an equal arbiter. We're not, and we're not selling out Ukraine. And you see and despite the way Trump plays it, he's not against NATO. He just wants wealthy, free European nations to pay their fair share. And everybody should. Heck, it used to be liberal Democrats would scream about it, with burden sharing. We're sick and tired of paying for the vast, for NATO when France, Germany, they're running their welfare states on the backs of American defense. That was something that showed up in the 70s and 80s. Reagan talked about it. And Scoop Jackson talked about it. Yeah, there's a classic defense Democrat. Well, Trump reaches the point where he says, and he's quite right, big debt, that's what strategic challenge column I write every year. That's a huge problem. And right now we're paying more, the United States is, in interest on the debt than the defense budget. We got to change that, or we're going to put ourselves into a poverty that we can't defend ourselves. This is something Eisenhower talks about after the Solarium War game in 1953. That's his change to the containment policies. Ike says containment's a great idea, but how do we sustain it? It's going to take a long, long time because it's a big siege. And this is how much I think we can pay for through time. It's one reason we have to have nuclear weapons in the mix, because we're not going to pay can't afford a huge land army and a huge navy. We'll spend ourselves into poverty and we will lose. I'm condensing what Eisenhower says out of that war game, but it becomes 162/2 at the National Security Council, a document which top secret forever until the end of the Cold War, and now you can read it online. You can actually read part of it. They declassified in I think 85, maybe something like that. Parts of it were obviously had not been published, but there were the top secret elements to the strategy plan. And to move it back to it's Trump. Trump's not the only one saying this, but he's doing something about it. Is we're going to collapse the debt. We're going to start having zero-based budgeting, and we're going to get rich again. If you get rich, you can defend yourselves. You can pay for what you need, and that is something that ought to change this put it in a slightly different perspective. That's something Beijing and Moscow both have to pay attention to. Is that the United States gets a hold of its gets a hold of its debt, suddenly we will be the world superpower. But I'll leave it at that.
Well, we'll have to wait and see if all that can be achieved. Let's sit there, and we'll talk to you next time.
Until then.
All right. Bye.
Bye, guys.